How to Create a Glitch, Monologues. Season 2. Chapter 5. This is the 5th episode of Season 2 of How to Create a Glitch in the Matrix Monologues. In this episode, I'll be building upon some of the ideas set out in the Season 2, Episode 3 in relation to the tonic and dominant social participants in a social exchange. Now, this idea essentially is in relation to the relationship between the tonic and the dominant social participants and how their relationship effectively alters the nature of a social exchange. Now, first of all, it's important to note that as I described in Season 2, Episode 3, the tonic maintains a low level of social tension during the course of a social dialogue. The dominant exhibits postural releases and largely mirrors the tonic individual in between each postural release. Now, the significance of this is important because the tonic only maintains their low level of social tension by and through the postural releases of the second individual who is the dominant. This means that the dominant has some measure of control over the internal states of the tonic, because as social tension builds and the tonic awaits a postural release from the dominant, he's going to find, or she's going to find her internal states to become stretched, the tension increased with all sorts of concomitant problems associated with that. So that's the first point I'd like to make. Now, the second point I'd like to make relates to the orientation of the two individuals and the consequences of that orientation. So I've used the word orientation to describe a great number of different concepts in these books and podcasts. I described how a gateway is created by a common orientation relative to some object. But what I'm talking about with the word orientation here is in relation to their emotional orientation. So, it's not a spatial orientation, it's an emotional orientation. And there are essentially two forms of emotional orientation. The first belongs to the tonic and the second belongs to the dominant. The first orientation, which belongs to the tonic. In that orientation, the individual's attention is fixed upon the environment or some object in the environment. As a result of that, the individual's attention is object-oriented, oriented and objective-oriented. So, the focus of the first orientation individual is on some physical task or some object in the environment. The second orientation, which is held by the dominant, involves the attention of the dominant being fixed on themselves relative to the tonic. So, there's an element of self-consciousness in the second orientation. And essentially what this means is that the attention of the tonic is focused on the environment. The attention of the dominant is focused on themselves relative to the tonic. This is how the social tension of the pairing is essentially managed. Now, the importance of this first orientation, the second orientation arrangement or relationship, is that it creates something called emotional coupling, which is to say the emotional state of the two individuals becomes linked together. And the reason for that is that every time a postural release is initiated by the dominant, the tonic individual obtains a release, and that release conditions his or her action towards the unconscious actions of the dominant. And basically, what that means is the second orientation individual develops a measure of control over the emotional states of the tonic individual. So, although the tonic individual maintains a low level of tension throughout, which is an advantage in one way, it's also a disadvantage in another way because the intentions of the tonic become linked to the intentions of the dominant. Now there's another aspect of this relationship as well, which is that although the intentions or emotional state of the tonic is linked to the actions of the dominant, the intention of the tonic is fixed on the environment, which makes them more capable in a practical sense of completing objectives in a spatial sense. So, the trade-off between this form of emotional coupling is that the individual who is tonic achieves some measure of improvement in their focus and in their ability to accomplish objective-oriented tasks, whereas the second-oriented individual acquires control over the first-orientated individual. So, there's a trade-off between these two relationships as to the ultimate implications of it. Now, what is the significance of this relative to the thesis of this podcast? Well, unfortunately for the second orientation individuals, in order to utilize the tangential action method of producing a glitch, one has to essentially put themselves in a position where they can maintain a first orientation stance. And the reason for that is because one's attention must be fixed on the background or the environment and objects in the environment in order to observe a glitch. one has to be in the right state of mind, and one's mind has to be ready to accept or observe that, which is truly unusual in the environment. So, if one's attention is fixed on themselves self-consciously relative to the tonic, that's going to be an extremely difficult orientation for the purposes of observing events of significance in the environment. Now, individuals do not always maintain the same orientation. Sometimes they form different orientations with different people, in different contexts, at different times. So, there's no single orientation or emotional orientation, which applies to a given individual. That being said, some individuals take on a second orientation more often than others do, and vice versa. So, in order to essentially establish a given orientation, one has to interpolate the methodology as applies to creating tension or releasing tension and mirroring. And what I mean by that is that if one purposely mirrors another individual, that's essentially taking on the role of the dominant interspersed by postural releases. So, one can simulate a particular orientation in a social grouping if one chooses. But one cannot force another individual to take on a given role within a social context. So, in some circumstances, it's not possible to, with certainty, establish a specific orientation. Anyway, thank you for listening. Those are my comments for today. If you have any comments, please comment, like or subscribe. Thank you. Bye.